So please welcome Natasha.
Is that a good sound? Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I've never, I've done cross-border meetings, but I've never done a presentation across the border, so it's exciting for me. I have been to Point Roberts before, but never for invasive species purposes. I feel very formal up here. I'm usually a little bit more casual about my presentations, but I'm happy that Bennett's wanting to record me tonight so that other people can view the presentation later on. So I'm happy to do that. But if you have questions throughout, I'm happy for you to stick up your hand and I can address them here. And just to note, I feel a little underprepared as far as knowing what's happening here in Point Roberts. Usually when I do these kinds of presentations in Metro Vancouver, I'm aware of what the particular jurisdiction is doing. I might even be working with the local government to remove some of their invasives. I'm hoping amongst the group that if there are questions that come up about what's happening here, what particular species you have here, that we can address that as a group, because I'm certainly not the expert about what's happening here in Point Roberts. So the aliens are coming. Well, actually the aliens are already here, and I got here a little bit early, and I collected a few plants that I noticed that are invasive here. They're the same ones that we have the other side of the border. So you definitely have invasive species here, probably not all of them, and maybe not all the ones I'm going to talk about. But as Rhiannon said, weeds and invasive species know no boundaries, and so what is a risk in Metro Vancouver would absolutely be considered a risk here in Point Roberts as well. And I always sort of preface my presentations as a little bit biology lesson, a little bit horror story, a little bit good news story. There's kind of a whole mix of things here. I'm going to start out with what I mean when I'm talking about an invasive species, the technical definition. I'm going to talk about some of the impacts that they're having, some of the ways that they're brought here in the first place, and then I'm going to review some of the priority species that we're dealing with, and you guys as well. And then I'm going to end with the good news, what is happening and ways that you can make a difference for the cause. So I'm going to start out with my technical slide. What is an invasive species? So my technical definition is it's a non-native species whose introduction causes economic harm, harm to human health, or environmental harm. So there's really two pieces to that. You have to be non-native, which means you've come from somewhere else in the world. Not just Alberta, not just sort of the next state down. Most of our invasive species have come from another continent. And so this whole idea, this concept, this conservation issue of invasive species really only occurs because of human intervention. Most of the invasive species we have could never have moved around except without human intervention. So many of the plants that have come from other continents just simply couldn't have got here except for humans bringing them along, whether we did that intentionally or not. So we expect that all living things have a certain range, a certain place they live on Earth, but they just wouldn't be able to move to the extent that we've seen with invasive species. So that's the non-native part. The other part is you have to be doing some really significant harm. So either economic harm, harm to human health, or environmental harm. So you sort of have to be meeting both of those definitions in order to be considered invasive. And it's considered the second greatest threat to biodiversity worldwide, second to habitat destruction, which is essentially development. And so it's a conservation issue that is really a worldwide problem. We're dealing with it here in the Pacific Northwest, but other countries, other continents are dealing with invasive species that have come from elsewhere, including here in North America. And they could range all types of species. I tend to focus a lot on plants, especially terrestrial plants, because they're sort of the easiest ones to deal with, and historically that's what land managers have been focusing resources on. But any living thing has the potential to be invasive. So mammals, insects, amphibians, funguses, bacteria, any living thing. What's a weed? This is, I put this slide in here to remind myself of the my definition of a weed. And I will use the word weed and invasive plant sort of interchangeably, but my definition of a weed is something growing where you don't want it to grow. And so my definition of a weed might be different from your definition of a weed. I sort of focus on native plants in my garden and sort of take a bit more of a natural approach, but I know other people, they're trying to remove salal or ferns or whatever it is from the yard because they have different values than I do. So weed is not really a technical term, there's a bit of value attached to what each of us would consider weed. And why are they successful? Again, because invasive species have been brought from somewhere else on Earth. When they are introduced into their new habitat, they have some real competitive advantages over their native counterparts. So invasive plants tend to be the super weeds of the plant kingdom. They tend to grow really rapidly. They tend to reproduce in a number of different ways. And they tend not to have the same controls or competition that would exist in the native environment, which allows them to grow really quickly and outcompete with everything else. So there might be species that would eat it, or funguses or diseases that might be predators of the species back in the native environment. But in the new environment, just plop down in the middle of brand new species, we tend to see that those relationships between the invasives and the native plants or animals just simply don't exist. And so the invasives are often overly successful because there's nothing keeping the competition or controls at a natural level. Unfortunately, many of our invasives tend to like disturbed sites and often thrive in extreme and varying conditions. Many of them do well in disturbed sites or dry and poor soils. And so in our urban area, especially more in the Metro Vancouver urban areas, a lot of our invasives are just really taking over a lot of the green spaces we find in the cities, including parks. Essentially, invasive species can live where other species can't. This competitive advantage makes them so successful that they just are able to take over much more quickly than their native species. So this is my schematic diagram to categorize invasive species. So species can be native, which means they've evolved over a long period of time on a certain place on Earth. And then we have non-native species, which are things, again, that have been moved around. And some other terms that we use to describe non-native are alien, exotic, or introduced. And really a lot of what we introduce into our gardens and that you can buy in nursery centers would fall under this category. They're not plants that necessarily grew in the Pacific Northwest, but nonetheless, they're non-invasive. So the large majority of non-native plants are really non-invasive. I put a picture of a palm tree in there. Anytime I'm driving through Tawasin, I always chuckle to myself at the palm trees in the median. Palm trees are not a native plant of the Pacific Northwest, and I think a lot of people would recognize that, even non-gardeners. And they're a good example of a non-native, non-invasive species. In my previous house, there was a palm tree in the front yard, and my husband loved it, and I hated it, being a biologist, because I knew that it didn't contribute any value to any of the wildlife living in the area. But on the same account, it was not invasive. I didn't have to spend every spring picking out thousands of palm tree seedlings from my front yard. It was just sort of there. I think it was probably infertile, actually. So again, much of what we plant and what we maintain in our yards would fit under the category of non-invasive, non-native. It's just a small percentage of non-native species that have the ability to be invasive that we're really concerned about. So I'm going to talk about some of the main impacts of invasives, starting with the ecological impact. So imagine, again, if you've brought invasive plants to a new habitat, they start quickly taking over. You often get what's shown in the purple photo here. That's a wetland plant called purple loosestrife, which, by the way, do you have here? Do you know if you have here?
I can't see the leaf, but I think I might have it.
Okay. I can show you some other photos later on. But it's truly a wetland species, so it would grow along your ditches and in sort of low-lying areas around sort of the wetland of the pond out back here. It absolutely grows in delta, so it's right at your doorstep if it isn't here yet. And it's a very beautiful flower. It produces many, many seeds every growing season, so it spreads very quickly by seed. It was first introduced to eastern North America, and it's just been sweeping its way across the continent for many decades now. And purple loosestrife, because it produces millions of seeds every growing season, it is very successful and can take over a wetland very quickly and produce what we call a monoculture, where essentially you have only the one species growing in an ecosystem. And in our native wetlands, we would expect a large diversity of plants, a number of wildflowers and probably a few shrubs and sedges and grasses and those sorts of things. But if something like purple loosestrife takes over, you find it just dominates. There probably are a few smaller species, you know, that you'd find if you were down on your hands and knees looking really closely. But for the most part, the invasive has taken over. And so that's bad news for all the native plants that require that habitat. It's also bad news for all the wildlife that depend on those native plants for habitat and for food. And I show a picture here of a deer. My crew, we have a seasonal crew that actually does treatment of some of our most challenging invasive plants, and they've done quite a bit of work for some of our BC parks on the North Shore Mountains. So, you know, up sort of north of North Vancouver, some of the ski hill areas. And our crew has noticed wildlife essentially ignoring the invasive species that exist on the ski slopes and in those areas. Essentially, native wildlife don't recognize invasive plants as valuable to them, even though they might be perfectly good to eat or perfectly good habitat. You know, they're tending to go for those native plants that, you know, they've grown up knowing. And so even though invasives, you know, could be beneficial for wildlife, often they're not utilized in that way. So there's lots of different impacts ecologically. Also species at risk, so those species that we want to pay particular attention to save because their numbers might be low or they're endangered, and invasive species are one of the single greatest threats that species at risk are facing. So health and safety impacts. This has sort of been a poster child of invasive species management in Metro Vancouver for a couple of years. Does anybody know what this plant is?
That's giant hogweed.
It is giant hogweed. If you ever see a plant this glorious and this large, you probably don't want to be standing next to it with bare arms and bare legs, because giant hogweed has a toxic sap in all parts of the plant that can cause quite significant burning if you get it on your skin. So it actually causes something called photodermatitis. So it's actually upon a chemical reaction with the sun that causes burning. People have been burned to the 3rd degree. There have been people that have gone blind, not so much in our region, but in other jurisdictions. These are photos from Washington State. The large photo, or the large stalk, when it gets to be this big, the stems are hollow. And probably what happened to this little guy is he came across a section of plant that may have been cut and put it up to his eye, and that's why his burn was in a circular pattern. And it's a really nasty burn. One of my staff members was burned a couple years ago. She was standing next to a patch. She was doing a video on identifying giant hogweed because it is very easily mistaken with some of our native and horticulture varieties, especially cow parsnip, which is a native plant. Even I have a hard time telling the difference sometimes if you have a really large cow parsnip or a really small hogweed. And there's also been some speculation that the plants are hybridizing as well, which always complicates things. Anyway, my colleague was standing next to the plant and realized afterwards that probably just via wind she got a little bit of sap on the back of her hand. And so she had already taken a preventative measure, which is wearing sunscreen. That can minimize the reaction with the sun if you do get the sap on your body. But it's not like a chemical burn that will heal and go away. It's the kind of burn that will reoccur if you're exposed to sunlight, which most people are, especially in the places where they're getting burned, faces, hands, those sorts of places. So it's absolutely a liability issue for people who manage land. They want giant hogweed removed as quickly as possible because most of the general public is not aware that there are plants that are toxic that you shouldn't be touching. This photo was staged just to show how easy it is for the public and for pets to come in contact with the plant. So in the first couple of years of its life cycle, it only sends out those basal leaves on the ground, and it looks very much like many other things out in nature. In our region, we always get new reports of giant hogweed every year, and fortunately, because it is a priority species, it's removed right away, and usually infestations don't, persist for too long. Although there's always the issue of the seed bed. If there are many seeds in the soil, then sometimes, there are historic sites where every year we have to go back and check because we know new hogweed plants will come up. But it's been found in the downtown of Vancouver. It's been found on, it really likes the dike areas and delta, so a lot of the agricultural areas have been impacted. So it can really grow anywhere. And I wouldn't be surprised if it is at Point Roberts or if it was at some point. This is another site at City of Vancouver Park where it was mowed, and so there's all these little tiny hogweed plants all over the grass, and it's just as deadly at this small stage than if you were to come across a mature plant. So moving off, physically contacting some of these plants. Another of the health and safety impacts that we worry about is reduced visibility on roadways, especially some of the highways throughout the region. Some invasives are, growing right alongside or even through the concrete, and so that can cause a safety issue. Erosion is another big issue, damage to infrastructure, and really those last few impacts, I'm really mostly talking about the knotweeds here. And I'll talk a little bit more about the knotweeds later, but they're a genus of plant that I'm going to pick on a lot because they're probably the nastiest invasive that we're dealing with in the region. This is an example of what it can grow through. So when I talk about damage to infrastructure, I'm actually talking about damage to infrastructure. In the UK, where knotweed has been existing for a lot longer than it has here in North America, they're a lot more aware of the damage it can do, and it can be really difficult to get a mortgage or get insurance on your property if you have knotweed growing. It's essentially treated like toxic waste if you have knotweed or knotweed contaminated soil. And it's starting to get a little bit like that in Metro Vancouver. One of my colleagues who works in the Squamish Whistler area had her first call this summer from an insurance agent wanting more information about this knotweed because he was looking at insurance on somebody's property that was quite heavily infested with knotweed. So, yeah, economic impact. So there's a cost associated with invasive species. They can impact forestry sector. There's impacts on recreational activities and tourism, especially in the urban area. There is not a single park or recreational area that hasn't been impacted in some way by an invasive species. Food systems, so not only can invasives impact people's ability to grow their own food in their own yard, but it's also having an impact on agriculture. So these are all indirect, cost. It's just, it takes more time and money and resources to do all of these things we want to do if we're battling invasives for the space we need. But there's also the direct cost, the management cost to deal with invasive species. And in the States, I think many of my colleagues in Canada are jealous about how much more money the United States has to deal with invasive species. Your programs are much more sophisticated than ours in Canada. And you've been working on invasive species for much longer than we have. And you guys have a lot of stuff figured out, but it's cost a lot of money. So it's a huge burden on taxpayers, to deal with these things. So where do they come from? Unfortunately, many invasive species, at least in Canada, are still available for sale at garden centers and nurseries. Some of them are illegal, some of them aren't. There's a bit of a lag time in legislation, and probably the same is true in the United States as well. You do have various lists, but they probably vary from county to county or municipality to municipality. And there's always, pressure from new species that are being brought in from outside of our region, and so there's always the potential for new invasives to be introduced. Any way that humans travel around, whether it's by vehicle or horseback or even hiking on the bottom of our shoes, we could potentially be spreading invasive plant parts and then moving an infestation into a new area. Wildflower seed mixes are notorious for having weed seeds in them. Sometimes they even list the invasive plant on the label, sometimes not. If you've ever grown a wildflower mix, often things pop up that you weren't expecting, so that's always something to watch for. Inappropriate disposal, despite the fact that most jurisdictions have a protocol for dealing with yard waste and sometimes even invasive plants, it's still very common for people to dump, as it is with garbage. People at the end of their lane or in a green space, there's still, people doing that. And many invasive plant infestations, sort of ground zero is often the remnant of an old hanging basket or, garden bags where people have just dumped. And oftentimes they just don't know any better. They think green is green, who cares? It's just, old yard waste or plants I don't want. They don't understand the impact of introducing that into the environment. And then people are maintaining invasive plants as well. I saw lots of ivy here in Point Roberts. It's a favorite, I know. This photo is not from Point Roberts, it's from Surrey. And whether the developer put the ivy in or whether the homeowner did, the ivy is literally crept over the fence into the little green space next door. And beyond the invasives actually growing off your property, there's also the issue of seed dispersal too. There are some bird species that will eat some of the invasive seeds, and then wherever they fly to is the next place where an invasive could pop up. We also know that maintenance activities, so we're mostly talking about mowing or even cutting or digging along roadsides and trails, is one of the greatest risks to the spread of invasive plants. And I did find a little patch of knotweed. I didn't have time to drive everywhere in Point Roberts, but I did some of the main roads, and I did find a little patch of knotweed in the ditch. And I suspect that it's come from some kind of ditch maintenance activity, probably mowing or whatever it is that happens along the ditches. Because it was outside of a lot that looks like it's completely empty and been cleared. So what's the solution? So we can prevent new invasives from coming, and we can prevent the spread of the ones we do have. We can carry out removal and control methods to try and remove the ones we have. We can restore sites that have been impacted by invasives. And the overarching solution, I think, is education and integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is really our term to describe how, there's never one solution to invasive species or invasive plants. You sort of have to take a multi-pronged approach to figure out, what's the best technique? Is it going to be multiple techniques? How can we incorporate prevention strategies? How can we educate people and sort of, kind of approach it from multiple angles? So I'm going to review some of the main ways that we're dealing with invasive plants. So mechanical control is physically removing or killing plants. So there's lots of different ways to do that, as you can imagine. Pulling, clipping, wrestling. Solarization is using the sun's energy to kill plants. So maybe you've put down some landscape fabric or some black plastic or something like that to kill everything underneath. The photo on the left here is a volunteer using a special tool called a weed wrench to remove Scotch broom, which is kind of a medium-sized shrub. The folks on the left are removing giant hogweed, so you can see the precautions they're taking because they don't want to get that sap on their skin. So they essentially wear chemical-resistant suits, a couple layers of gloves, and then they usually duct tape any seams so that there's no chance of any sap getting in, and then a face mask. And they're just cutting off the seed head of a giant hogweed right there so that it's not able to reproduce or send out seeds for the next year or so. So mechanical control is probably one of the most common control methods in our region. It's certainly the most common control method for the majority of species, and it's certainly what a lot of the volunteers are up to. So I'm not sure if you guys have any stewardship groups here or work parties in any of the parks, but we have a number actually a large number of active groups in Metro Vancouver, people stewarding their local park, and a lot of what they're doing is mechanical control. So pulling the ivy off the trees or pulling the Scotch broom like that lady there. Chemical control is another method that is fairly widely used in our region for a few different species. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Cultural control first. So cultural control is essentially changing human behavior to essentially encourage native plants and to try and manage the land in a way that makes it less hospitable for invasives. So you might be encouraging the growth of native plants, you might be fertilizing or tilling the soil or doing whatever it is to kind of minimize the success of the invasives that might be around. Invasivism is kind of a new term, and it's what we use to describe when people try and utilize invasive plants, usually as a food source. So there's all sorts of interesting things that are happening in the Pacific Northwest, like invasive bake-offs and cook-offs where people are using invasives, as a food source, and they're having bullfrog stews and knotweed soups, things like that. And it's sort of, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's a lot of fun, but it's, those kinds of events are really raising awareness. Having people, use invasives to for any sort of purpose, including food, is not going to ever get rid of the invasive itself. But I think those kinds of events really help raise awareness that there are interesting and innovative ways that we can get rid of invasives. Okay, now on to chemical control. So chemical control is using herbicides or chemicals to kill plants, and there are also a number of different ways that those can be applied. So this is a backpack sprayer here. There's also stem injectors that can be used for plants that have hollow stems, so that would include the knotweeds that I'm going to talk a bit about later. You can use wipe on, paint on, so there's a number of different ways that you can apply herbicides to plants. There are a number of pesticide bans and regulations, certainly within BC and really in any jurisdiction, so it's a highly regulated chemical control method, and you have to, in BC anyway, you have to be licensed if you're working on public property for government, and you have to use, this is an example of signage that we use if we're using herbicide, and there's requirements about what has to go on the sign, who did the application, what the application date was, what species you're targeting, so that if the public comes across a treatment site, it can be educated about what specifically the activity was for. And certainly in BC, and especially in our urban areas in Metro Vancouver, there's a lot of sensitivity about herbicide use. And I don't think any practitioner that's using herbicide is taking it lightly. It's usually only used in the case of there's no other treatment possibility, which is the case with knotweed. There's no other way to treat it except with herbicide, and so it's sort of the last tool in the toolbox that we use. All right, I'm going to review some of the usual suspects. Okay, I'm going to start with the knotweed. So there's actually a number of different species of knotweed in the region. There's 4 different species, but they're all really bad, and they all look fairly similar, and they're all managed in very similar ways. So I'm just going to collectively call them the knotweeds. So this is a little sample of knotweed that I collected today. So there's a few things that I can tell about this plant. It looks a lot greener than a lot of the larger patches that I saw even on my way coming here. So it makes me think that it was either mowed or introduced by seed or something fairly recently. It also was quite small. It was probably this far off the ground, where a mature knotweed at this time of year, if it had grown from the springtime, would be my size or larger depending on what species it is. So yeah, it's possible that this knotweed has very recently come to your region, which is very, very scary. It's the most challenging species that we deal with. And yeah, knotweed is a real beast. So knotweed was evolved to grow as a first colonizer in the parts of Asia where it's native to. So you can imagine maybe a volcano or some kind of catastrophic storm. Knotweed would be one of the first plants to grow. So it requires very little. It can literally grow from a rock or very little soil and water and nutrients and those sorts of things. So it's challenging that way because it can really grow anywhere, but it's also challenging because it spreads very easily. I'm going to be very diligent about not bringing this back across the border with me because I don't want to get in trouble. Usually when I come to these things, I bring a whole bunch of stuff with me. I collect stuff around my neighborhood, and I also have a large herbarium where I have pressed samples of all of the invasives, but I didn't want to risk bringing those across the border. Even though the herbarium poses no risk because the plants are dried, I didn't want to get into a conversation with the border guard about how they're not viable. So I collected what I could in the hour that I was here early. So so what I can tell you about knotweed is it also spreads very easily. So any little bit of the root or any little bit of the stem can propagate a new plant, which is why I'm going to be diligent about disposing of it carefully before I leave, and also not bringing it with me back to Canada because we have our fair share of knotweed there as well. So knotweed essentially creates monocultures. It just excludes everything else wherever it grows, and it forms a huge, extensive root system underneath the ground. So it is a perennial species, which means the stuff below the ground persists for many years, but all the above ground stuff dies off. So if you were to come and check out this little infestation that I found within a couple of weeks, actually maybe even a couple days or a week, the leaves will be starting to dry, they'd fall off, and then you just see dead stalks sort of sticking up out of the
Are you going to tell
ground.
us where you found that?
I can tell you, yeah. I don't remember the street name, but if you turn right on the main street and then turn left at the next street, whatever. Yeah, so it's probably.
Across the street from my house.
Was it past the church?
Are you at Johnson?
I can show you on a map. It's probably easier if I show you. It's probably a kilometer now, and you guys know kilometers.
Yes.
Yeah, it's sort of by an empty patch, and I kind of wasn't expecting to see knotweed, but I just happened to see it poking up out of the ditch, and I have an eye for these things.
I asked
So.
because my neighbor was growing it.
Oh, okay. So you do know that it is
He
here.
removed it.
Okay.
With great effort, which involved actually pouring gasoline on it and setting
Yeah.
fire to it.
Yeah.
But it's not in that neighborhood. I was just wondering if some seeds.
Yeah.
By the
I can try and pinpoint it afterwards on my phone on a map if you guys want to see.
Yeah.
But you,
Yeah.
now that you know what it looks like, and if anybody's welcome to take this home, I think you'd fairly easily find it. Yeah. Yeah, so what else do I want to say about knotweed? Yeah, so, you know, there are cases in BC where we have infestation along one side of the highway, and then literally under 4 lanes of traffic, up pops knotweed, and it's actually the same individual. They send out roots or modified roots called rhizomes that go many meters down and many, many meters laterally. It's absolutely amazing what this plant can do.
It's like bamboo.
Pardon me?
It's like bamboo.
It is like bamboo, and a lot of people mistake it for bamboo, or another common name is actually false bamboo, which is one of the reasons why in my line of work, scientific names are often used. If people call me and they say, I've got this really aggressive plant in my yard, it's bamboo, usually it's knotweed. Bamboo is also aggressive and is also invasive, but it doesn't show up in parks and natural areas and roadsides like the knotweed does. So I've got some photos to show more about the devastation of knotweed. So this is what it looks like under a patch of knotweed. It actually is pretty barren. If you're able to treat knotweed with herbicide, there's nothing else that's at the site. If you're able to essentially remove the knotweed from the site, there is nothing else growing there because it's just so aggressive. This is an example of where knotweed would have been causing a sightline issue, a safety issue along the highway. It's so quickly growing that within a couple of weeks the knotweed canes would be swooping out onto that upper lane of traffic there. This was a site that we treated for our highway department a couple of years ago, and knotweed often spreads when there's a new development project or some new materials, soil or something like that brought in, and there's a new culvert put in right beside that road median there, so it was contaminated with knotweed somehow, and then very quickly started moving in the site. So one of the reasons why we use herbicide to treat knotweed is that decades of research in BC, but even more so in Washington State, you guys are way ahead of us in dealing with knotweed and knowing what are best management practices. You know that herbicide is really the only effective form of control. So people, you name it, I've heard of it, pouring gasoline, diesel, flaming it, covering it for 10 years, clipping it a couple of weeks throughout the growing season for 10 years, and still it doesn't, make a difference. The infestation is usually what it was before or worse. This is what knotweed is doing to many of our stream banks, especially on the North Shore. So knotweed, again, can grow anywhere, including up to and into creeks and streams. There are some entire stream systems where there are islands of knotweed in the stream where there were no islands before. And unfortunately, in BC, there are regulations that restrict the use of herbicides within so far, like 1 meter of the high water mark of a water body. And so we unfortunately don't have any other tools. These types of areas we can treat up to 1 meter, and then unfortunately there's nothing we can do. So we're really looking to the states as our precedent for getting the Canadian government to update the regulations to include some of the herbicides and products that you guys are using to treat knotweed in aquatic areas. Yes?
Do goats like them?
Goats will eat knotweed. So there's a goat herder that's done some work in BC. They mostly work on other invasives, but they have worked on knotweed. It's not their species of choice, but if you enclose them in an area where there's nothing but knotweed, they will eat it. The challenge is, especially because I work in Metro Vancouver, which is highly urbanized, is that knotweed is growing in amongst native vegetation or in people's yards. Most of the areas where we find knotweed wouldn't be suitable to have a herd brought in because they would just destroy everything. But yeah, goats will eat it. And actually humans eat it too. When they first pop up out of the ground, apparently you can eat them kind of like a green vegetable, a bit like an asparagus. I've never had it myself, but someday, maybe if we have some kind of invasive barbecue or something, maybe I'll try and make it, but I haven't tried it myself. So giant hogweed. So I've already shown this picture and talked a little bit about hogweed before. It's a very aggressive plant as well. It produces these large umbel-shaped flowers that can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds every growing season. So it's definitely a challenge in that way. This is what the flower stalks look like. And this is often what we find when we get to a site when somebody's reported hogweed. Often it's more of a hogweed forest. And here's another example where we might choose to use herbicide rather than be digging or cutting the plants out, really because it's a safety risk for the staff. It's easier for them to spray the hogweed rather than go in there and increase the risk of getting the sap on themselves. Scotch broom, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, am I right?
Yep.
You're familiar with it? I found lots.
Yes.
Okay, well, with the exception of blackberry, which is everywhere here as well, I did find quite a bit of Scotch broom as well. It is absolutely considered invasive. It's kind of an interesting story. It was, I'm sure your Scotch broom came from us, so I apologize for that. Probably most of your invasives came from us. But the story of how it was introduced to BC is there was a captain in the Navy who took some Scotch broom seeds from Hawaii. It was actually invasive to Hawaii as well. But he collected some broom seeds from Hawaii, planted them in Souk, which is a suburb of Victoria. Of 3 seeds that he planted, we now have this large infestation of broom that is really detrimental on Vancouver Island and is moving its way very far north. And it's been on the mainland for a long time as well. It's quite well established in many places. So Scotch broom is a shrub, and it is a member of the legume plant family. And so you can come and look at my sample later if you like, but you can see that it grows green pods like in the photo there, and the pods just get darker and blacker and bigger in the heat of the summer sun, and eventually they actually split open, and you can see the 2 sides of the pods that have split open here, and the seeds essentially get ejected out of the plant. And if you're anywhere in, say a hot, sunny August afternoon where there's a lot of Scotch broom, you can actually hear the seeds being ejected. It almost sounds like somebody's shaking castanets or something. Another challenge with broom is that the seeds can be viable for many, many years. Some people say up to 50 years in the soil. So just a testament to the fact that when you're dealing with invasives, it's always a long-term effort. You could potentially be removing all of the visible broom at a site, but then have to be returning for up to 50 years to make sure that there aren't little broom seedlings that are popping out from the seeds that are left in the seed bank. Yes?
Since we have our fire chief here, let's raise an issue about Scotch broom. I read that it's highly flammable.
Yes.
And if there's like a brush fire, it can aggravate it.
Very true. Yeah, it's a plant where it would also fall under the category of human health and safety. So naturally, Scotch broom has a high oil content in the branches and the stems, whether they're dead or alive, and so it makes them highly flammable. Especially problematic where it's growing along roadsides, which it is, especially on Vancouver Island. I mean, it was actually planted by our highway and utility departments up until a couple of decades ago in these areas where we put a highway in because or a hydro line or something, because we knew it wasn't going to get big like a tree, and we knew that it would grow anywhere, so they actually planted it on purpose. And so there are entire swaths down some of these rights of ways and along roadsides that could go up really fast if a car fire started or there were sparks or something like that. So yeah, the combination of the broom along highways is kind of a bad thing. English ivy, which I didn't collect, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Another question? Oh yes.
I believe there is a native, what's considered as a native. It's a smaller growing, it's pale yellow. It's relative, but it isn't invasive, is what I understand. So that.
I know of a smaller broom that I found in our region. It's called, I think I've heard people call it white broom. Like the flowers are not quite as bright yellow. They're more understated,
Yeah,
sort of whitish.
Pale.
And we consider that invasive, although I haven't seen it very often. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the challenges. I generally recommend that people don't plant varieties of invasive plants. I probably would give the public different advice than I would give folks like you. You're probably much more educated about, plants and, what would be considered invasive or not than the general public who might be, looking in a store and not even thinking about these things. But my general recommendation for the public is that people not plant varieties of things. So if it's at all related to the Scotch broom, unless it's a native plant, but I don't believe it's native. I'm not aware of a native
It's in the Fort
broom.
Lewis area.
Sorry?
It's in the Fort Lewis area.
Oh, okay. English ivy, I don't have a sample of that, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. It's probably one of the most commonly introduced horticulture invasive plants that we have in our region. It, unfortunately, is one of the ones that is still legal to sell and buy and maintain. Nonetheless, it's absolutely considered invasive. It's been a real problem in our Stanley Park, which is one of our large prized urban parks. We have a stewardship group there that's been working really hard to remove all of the ivy. So as of last year, they had removed all of the ivy from the trees, which is really the priority. So ivy is a ground cover, but its mission in life is to grow vertical, either up a tree or up a pole. And that's when it can produce those flowers and seeds. That's really the way that it can produce sexually, is if it can get vertical, get high enough. So the challenge is when it's growing in a tree is just the sheer volume of ivy growing in trees. Sometimes there's more ivy on the tree than there is tree biomass itself, and in a big windstorm, ivy can bring down branches, it can bring down entire trees. Also, if the ivy is totally covering the branch or the bark of the tree, sort of like in the photos there, it can make the tree more susceptible to wood bugs and diseases and those sorts of things. So they're not a parasite on the ivy, on the trees, but they definitely impact the health of the trees for sure. And the priority would be removing it from the trees and then removing it from the ground as well. It is a species that birds will eat the berries of, so it is one of the ways it's being spread around. So that's my argument for people that say, well, I love my ivy and I keep it trimmed back, in my garden bed or whatever it is. But if it's allowed to go to flower and then seed, who knows where it's going? It's probably leaving their property. Himalayan blackberry probably needs no introduction. So there are actually 3 blackberries in the region. There is a native blackberry, which I did find actually quite a bit of here. I didn't want to cut it because I don't want to harm the native plants. But there are 2 that are invasive. So the most common one is the Himalayan blackberry, which is so widespread in the region. And when I say the region, I'm talking about your little pocket of Point Roberts as well. It's so widespread that people are often surprised, at least from the public's perspective, that it's actually invasive. Like, well, hasn't it always been here? Well, it's been here for a long time for sure, but we still consider it invasive. We won't ever get rid of it, and there aren't a lot of people that are actively managing it unless it's in the way of something else that might be a higher priority, or unless it's on your property and you don't want blackberry, or if it's impacting infrastructure or growing on a trail or something like that. So it's got those typical leaves with 5 leaflets, and if anybody's ever worked with blackberry, which I'm sure many of you have, whether it's dead or alive, those thorns are nasty. So definitely very challenging to work with. It's actually pretty easy to remove, except for the thorns. If it wasn't for the thorns, it'd be You know, it's one of the species that is pretty winnable if you spend a bit of time digging it out. English holly, which I didn't see here, but I suspect that there probably is some.
There is.
Okay. In natural areas or in people's yards?
People's gardens.
Both.
Both, actually.
Both. Yeah. Holly it's always been a priority species, but it's gaining a lot of notoriety in our region in the last year or two because we're seeing it invade intact forests a lot more than we were before. And I see it in a lot of places where there's no other holly around. It's just been brought in by a berry. Again, it's one of these plants that a bird will, eat a seed and then its droppings will fall somewhere else and then up pops an English holly grove. So it's, when invasives start impacting our intact forests and ecosystems and natural spaces, that's when we really start to worry, and English holly is really starting to do that in our region. And so it's a species that we're sort of paying a little bit more attention to. It's kind of a nasty plant to deal with as well. It's really spindly and it kind of sends out little shoots everywhere, and it can be really difficult to get rid of as well. I get calls sometimes from people that say, I just heard that holly is invasive and I got this big tree on my property and I don't know what to do, and it's really tough in those situations because it would be a huge cost for them to hire a tree company to come and remove it, and it would disturb the soil and everything. So and until people no longer desire to have it, and until some of those older sort of horticulture variety hollies die off, it's going to be a real challenge to get a handle on this species, I think. Yes?
How would you identify winter red holly or something like that?
So the English holly is the most common one. It is technically a shrub, but it can get up to be the tree size. It's the most common holly that you find in garden centers and in people's yards and things. It doesn't have any variegated leaves, just a solid green color, and has the typical red berries. Again, it's a species that or a genus that I wouldn't recommend other people pursue as a garden plant. I wouldn't recommend any hollies to plant. Garlic mustard is a species that you probably don't have here in Point Roberts. There are only a few sites that we know of in Metro Vancouver, and they're being very actively managed. So there's sort of a scale that we think of. If a species has been here for a long time and there's a lot of it, we tend not to put a lot of our resources into that. We tend to focus our resources more on the species that are new to our region, that we can actually have a chance of eradicating or getting rid of altogether. And garlic mustard would meet the latter category. A couple of, actually, I guess about 7 years ago, we had a woman that came to one of our regional conferences from Portland, and everybody always has their pet invasive, and hers was garlic mustard, and she talked a lot about garlic mustard, how you need to keep it out of BC, you need to really keep a watch on the species because once it's here, it'll just spread like wildfire. So we were really saddened that a couple sites were identified just this past year. Hopefully you guys don't get it here, but garlic mustard, it is actually an edible plant. If you crush the leaves in your hands, it does smell like garlic. It's a biennial plant, and it looks different in year 1 than it does in year 2. So year 1 is the photo on the left. It sort of produces more heart-shaped leaves, and it does not flower. The second year it produces more of the arrow-shaped leaves, and it then flowers that year. And it just spreads so rapidly, even in the areas where it was identified this year. I can't believe how big the populations were. But I think, very quickly in one season, it got really big. It probably had been here for a year or two, and then suddenly this year it just sort of caught somebody's attention. One of them is in Burns Bog, which is a very large managed area in our region. And then another one was in one of our regional parks. So it's definitely kind of on our watch species. I suspect, like a lot of invasives that we think are new to the region, there are probably more pockets of it that we just haven't identified yet. Parrot feather, which you may have here, again, it's totally an aquatic species, so it actually grows right up to the water column. It's kind of similar to Eurasian water milfoil, which you might know if you boat at all or fish and have traveled in the Pacific Northwest. But parrot feather is another sort of newcomer to the Metro Vancouver area. and it'll root down in the bottom of a pond or a ditch in the case of the photo here, and actually go right up to the water column, and then a few inches above the water it actually sticks up and it looks like little trees. And the area on the left, like that's actually a large ditch. It looks like you could walk out on it, but there's a couple of feet of water there. And I've seen it just completely covering ponds, actually fairly close to where I live, where it used to be a pond and now it's just completely covered in this parrot feather. So it totally changes the ecology of the water and the water system. And much like a lot of the invasives, they can spread by seed, they can spread vegetatively by little bits of the plant floating downstream or further along in the ditching system. And aquatic invasives pose a lot of challenges because they're really difficult to control. It's sort of like, what do you do with them? There's been some experiments in Richmond with covering their ditches because it needs full sun, and so they're trying to figure out if there's ways that they could shade the ditches to try and get rid of it. So we're still in the early stages of figuring out how best to treat the parrot feather. Wild chervil is another fairly recent species to our region. It comes from kind of the interior of BC, and it's just been kind of traveling down highway number 1, and it's in here in our region as well. And wild chervil is also a member of the carrot plant family, so it's sort of distantly related to the giant hogweed and the cow parsnip and the angelicas. It's a very early blooming plant. It is very beautiful. It looks a little bit like baby's breath or something like that. But wild chervil is becoming a real problem on our highways. If you head out on Highway 1 into the interior of the province around the springtime, you would see that much of the medians and along the sides of the highway that chervil is really spreading. And we're starting to see in other places too, Vancouver, and there's quite a bit of it in Richmond and places like that. So another challenge with chervil is, again, we're finding that it's really difficult to control. We're sort of at a loss of what to do. It seems to be a bit resistant to herbicides. It doesn't really respond super well to mowing, so there's some trials going on trying to figure out what the best way to deal with wild chervil is, but it may be an up-and-coming species that you might see here. English cordgrass or spartina, is anybody familiar with this species? Yeah, it's kind of an interesting species. Most of what I know about spartina I've learned from my counterparts in Washington State. You guys have had spartina in Washington State and Oregon and California as well for many years, and it was discovered in 2003 in Roberts Bank and Boundary Bay area, so it literally had spread its way up in the ocean. One of the interesting projects that we did when we first discovered it was a drift card study where we made up drift cards that had information about what to do if you found a drift card, and they were laminated in plastic, and then they were released in areas where we knew spartina existed, and we sort of tracked where we got the calls from. So a couple calls from Alaska and kind of up the coast, but most of the drift cards were found locally, and it was just to help us identify where we should be looking for spartina, because we wanted to really get a handle on the species, knowing what your government folks have been dealing with for many decades. So spartina was actually introduced as a species to help stabilize banks, or essentially make it easier to develop on the edge of the ocean, because it sort of increased the area of land and sort of shortened where the shore area was. It totally changes drainage patterns. Again, kind of like the knotweed that I was talking about. If it grows in a mud flat, it can actually change sediment patterns and actually sort of extend where the shoreline is as well. Spreads very easily, and again, just the nature of where it grows, it's really difficult to control. There's a picture of me many years ago with volunteers, and we were hand pulling this stuff. Our government, after years of sort of badgering the government for us to get herbicide approval to use something on the spartina found here in BC, we finally were able to do that as of a couple of years ago. So we really appreciate the work and the expertise and the history that Washington State had had dealing with the species and sharing it with us, and really sort of supporting us through our work on spartina. Unfortunately, spartina is still is sort of growing in population. It's a really hard species to control. So it's something that we're continuing to work on. There are lots of other plant species. I can't cover them all. There are literally hundreds that we're dealing with, but I sort of covered the most common ones. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the other non-plant invasives that we're dealing with in the region. This is sort of a one-off story called the northern snakehead fish, and it was one fish that was discovered in Burnaby a couple of years ago. So it's kind of a good news story. It's kind of a citizen science story is what I call it, because it's usually not somebody like me that identifies something new to our region. It's usually a member of the public that identifies something unusual. In the case of the snakehead fish, it had been released into a highly urbanized pond in Central Park in Burnaby, and it may have been introduced through the aquarium industry. So people who are aquarium enthusiasts have snakehead fish that are live. You can also buy them as a food source in Chinatown and other areas where people actually eat it. So we're not sure where it came from, but somebody didn't want it anymore and released it into this pond, and a local resident was out with his kids and saw this really unusual fish with multiple rows of teeth and looked really ferocious and didn't look like something that lived in Burnaby. And he ended up taking a video of it and posting the video on YouTube, and then one of his buddies saw it and thought, we should probably call somebody about this. And so they did, and then, you know, very quickly there's federal government reps and provincial government, local government, all this, you know, huge effort. They actually ended up draining part of the pond because it was a human-made pond, so they were lucky in that it was a really easy water body to, you know, try and capture a fish like this. So they lowered the water body and were able to capture it, and they euthanized it and dissected it to determine whether it was able to reproduce, but it wasn't. I think it was a male fish anyway. But it was a really scary finding. I think it was really kind of a wake-up call that, wow, there's a lot of other things out there besides plants that we kind of need to focus on, and perhaps we need to do some education around, you know, not releasing pets or other living things. Again, just because it's a living thing doesn't mean that it belongs in the environment. So the snakehead fish is actually a pretty scary fish if you do the research. They're very primitive. They actually have modified lungs and can live outside of water for a short time, so they can actually jump out, squirm on land for a bit, and jump into another water body. And they're ferocious predators. There have been cases where they've gone after birds and small mammals and even small pets. And so fortunately, the only known infestation of a live snakehead fish in the environment in Canada was the one in Burnaby, and it was swiftly removed and destroyed, but it could happen again. There's a whole program in BC that's just got underway called Don't Let It Loose, and it's all about educating pet owners and pet stores about you know, not just releasing things into the environment. You know, your turtles, your fish, all those other things, they need to find an appropriate place to be when you're finished with them. European fire ant was discovered in BC in 2010, and there's confirmed locations in many places in Metro Vancouver. It's probably way more widespread than we think. The European fire ant, again, I have a sample of dead ants, but I didn't want to bring them across the border. But they're not that exciting. They're very small red ants. They look a lot like any other ants. We've got about 85 ant species in BC, and they, you know, to the naked eye, they look, you know, a lot like everything else. And there are a lot of other stinging ants, and there are a lot of other red ants in BC. It really takes an expert to identify whether what people have found is the European fire ant. It's really more the behavior of the European fire ant that really distinguishes the identification. So what happens, these ants grow in colonies in underground, quite dense colonies, and there can be multiple queens in a colony. In a typical backyard, say the size of this room, there could be maybe like 12 colonies, all with multiple queens. And if they detect movement, they will emerge very quickly from their nests, and they will swarm and they will sting. And so it's not, you know, when people have been impacted by European fire ant, it's not just a couple of stings, it's usually people getting stung multiple times. In people that have European fire ant on their properties, there are also a number of public parks that have this. It's just totally rendered the space unusable for humans and for pets because you just don't want to be anywhere near the fire ants. A couple weeks ago, there was a news story out of New Westminster. It was the first case of somebody having an anaphylactic shock due to European fire ant. So he just was overwhelmed so quickly and got stung so many times and then had a reaction that he required hospitalization. So that's pretty scary. It's a plant that we think is being spread in garden materials. So one of the infestations in our region was at a garden center, and who knows how long it had been there. So it was in their plant material, their stock, and so people are buying stuff, taking it home. You're not necessarily looking for ants when you're at the garden center, and you just pop it in the ground, and so it's spreading that way in soil, in plant material, and then once you have a colony, they can very easily reproduce and spread out further. The European chafer beetle is another invasive insect that is getting a lot of attention in our region. So the European chafer beetle, the beetle's larval stages look like those white grubs right there, and the grubs actually are aiming for, sort of turf grass, like our traditional garden grass, yard grass. And they will actually do damage to the grass because they nibble on the roots. But the most significant damage is done when all the animals that love to eat the grubs come onto your property, and that's the damage that you see in the photo there. So things like crows and raccoons. The epicenter of the European chafer beetle infestation is very close to where I live, so I'm very familiar with entire boulevards and yards that look like little bombs have gone off, and it's really because of this chafer beetle. And now, for the first time this year, the city of Vancouver has had to shut down some of their sports fields because the European chafer beetle has just, destroyed it to an extent where people can't use it anymore. It's a safety issue.
How large is the larva?
They're probably about the size of like a nickel. They're even larger. They're quite large. Yeah. I am pretty sure that I have them on my property, but I don't have a lot of grass. I have a lot of moss. And I have a lot of veggie garden beds as well, and they don't seem to go after any of my veggies, which is great. They really seem to be going after grass. I think there's been a lot of talk in our region about changing the culture of growing manicured grass instead of all the other options that are available. It's becoming easier to buy clover and other seed mixes because people that have had the European chafer beetle are sort of fed up. They're just trying other things. So it's actually introduced kind of an interesting environmental topic as well. So that's the chafer beetle. There's not a lot of great ways to get rid of it. There is a biological control. So biological control is the introduction of a host-specific predator for the specific invasive. So in this case, it's a nematode. It's a microscopic worm. You buy a powder, you add water to it, you sprinkle water on your lawn, and then if the chafer beetle is in the area, the nematodes will actually attack the chafer beetle and go for it. And there's been varying success with that biological control. American bullfrog, I'm sure you probably have them here, although maybe not. They're quite a large amphibian. They are very loud. The challenge is that they displace native frogs, and they also eat native frogs. They're notorious predators. They will actually eat their own kind. I used to work at the Vancouver Aquarium, and we had this really cool specimen there of bullfrog with another bullfrog stuck in its mouth. So these guys will just go after anything. And so this one bullfrog, literally its eyes were too big for its mouth, and it went after one of its own kind, and then it got stuck in the mouth, and then in the process, both of them died. So that was like a really visual example of just how ferocious the bullfrogs are. So yeah, there's bullfrogs are fairly widespread. They were introduced in the region as a potential food source, or at least they were farmed as a potential food source, and I've never seen frog legs available in my supermarket, so it never took off. And then people released all of these frogs, and then now they've just sort of taken over. So zebra and quagga mussels are species that we don't currently have in BC, and we really hope to keep it that way. They've been very detrimental on the eastern part of the continent. So they're very, very tiny. They're just sort of the size of your nail. And they They can produce millions of eggs every year, and they will just grow on anything. Some of my colleagues who work in the Okanagan in places where there's a lot of water bodies, they want samples to show people what they look like. So they'll send something like a piece of pipe, to somebody in Ontario, and they'll pop it in a lake for like 3 weeks and pull it up, and the thing will just be covered in zebra or quagga mussels in areas where the zebra mussels are invasive. And then they'll send it back, and we're like, encapsulating it in resin and those sorts of things.
There are lakes in California where they won't let people launch their boat
Exactly.
unless they're treated before they go in.
Exactly. And so again, you guys in the States have a much more sophisticated program for monitoring boat traffic, especially from lakes and areas where the mussels exist. To areas where they do not exist. We have a new program in BC, it's called the Invasive Mussel Defense Program, where we do have inspection stations set up at various border crossings and major highways and truck stops and those sorts of things, but it's hard to catch everybody, and because the larval stages of the mussels are so small, they're microscopic, you can't see them by the naked eye. It's very difficult to detect these things, and once they get into a water system, there's really no management options. They're there. And so especially in BC, because we rely so much on hydroelectric power, where it's a real concern because it could be very detrimental to hydroelectric dams and other aquatic infrastructure as well.
So they don't have any natural predators?
Yeah, not in our region, and there hasn't been any research on how those natural predators could be introduced. Sometimes the natural predators might be invasive as well, and so it's sort of like, do we want to introduce something that could be even worse than what we already have? So the good work is lots of work is being done. Obviously, I'm not including you guys in the map here because I'm not managing any of Point Roberts, but it's part of my job to help coordinate efforts between all of the Metro Vancouver jurisdictions. So a little bit about us. The way the model that BC has sort of chosen is that each region is being coordinated by a not-for-profit organization. So I work for a not-for-profit society. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary this summer. And part of our mandate is education and outreach. So we answer questions from the public, from land managers, from anybody who needs information. We do presentations and attend community events like this. So by the way, if any of you are involved with other groups in Canada or even here in Point Roberts that you think might benefit from an invasive presentation, you can let me know. I do a lot of training of government staff and volunteers, and we also operate seasonal field crews. We've got these alien buster logos on our trucks and things, and we're out actually doing work on mostly the challenging invasives. The hogweed and the knotweeds are kind of our specialty plants. So ways that you can help. So prevention, again, I talked about how that's a really beneficial form of control. It's really the cheapest form of control. It's sort of the work that we can do before things get out of hand. So this is an example of a wash station. It's an ATV event where somebody is recognizing that they might be in an area where there are invasives, they're washing their equipment before they take it off site, and it's kind of an extreme example of how somebody's taking precautions, but it's just a reminder to be cognizant of what it is that you could be traveling with, whether it's on your vehicle or your hiking boots or on your pet or whatever. If you're traveling throughout the region, what potentially could be hitchhiking. There's a program out of the University of Minnesota called Play Clean Go, and it's been adopted by many, many people and agencies throughout North America, and it's all about educating recreational users about invasive species and about minimizing the impact and the spread. You can also make wise decisions about plant choices where you garden, so know what you grow. Avoid anything that might be called fast spreaders or vigorous self-seeders. So those kinds of descriptions might be a clue that the plant may be invasive or have invasive tendencies, and often in those cases they're probably not something you want growing in your garden anyway. Because as gardeners, usually you don't want just one thing taking over, right? You want a lot of things growing together. If you do have invasives, you can consider replacing them or pulling off the dead flowers, deadheading them before they go to seed. You can get advice on your invasives. So if you find an invasive on your property or you find one here in Point Roberts, I can help with what might be the best methods to remove them. Also, soil is kind of notorious for having invasive plant stuff, so just know where you get your soil from. You guys probably don't have a lot of options, but hopefully your nursery here is reputable and buys from reputable vendors. There's another program in BC called PlantWise, and there's sort of two wings. One of them is about educating commercial growers and nursery centers about invasives, and they can actually sign on to become invasive free, where they actually undergo an audit process and they have to agree to eliminate invasives from their stock, and they agree to, educate the public. But then there's also a whole public education side where, we're doing outreach in the community and doing presentations like this to garden centers and garden clubs. Identification, so attend a workshop, check, you guys have already done that. You can learn to recognize plants in all the growth stages. So you might think, if you saw a plant like this, oh, it kind of looks like that giant hogweed that she talked about, but would you know what it looked like in its early growth stages? So that's one thing to note. There's probably going to be a lot of invasives that you see from now on in Point Roberts, and it's not necessarily your responsibility to manage, but you can be aware of what they look like as they pop up out of the ground and what they look like during the winter, so that you can recognize them in other places. And be on the lookout for new infestations. So not only new places where you hadn't seen maybe knotweed before, but also entirely new plants altogether. Again, people that are aware of invasive species can really help become allies and identify, new sites of things that pop up. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of apps here, but I don't think they would work actually here in Point Roberts. But if any of you work or do business in Canada, it might be an option for you. So for a number of years, we've had a provincial database where we've been trying to collect information about invasive plant infestations. But now we have this mobile app that people can download for free, and you can actually report these things. And I actually use these a little bit as an ID guide too, because if you are wondering about a plant and you pull it up, you can actually see photos. So if you're looking at a plant, you can use the app to kind of cross-reference and help identify whether it is the invasive you think it is. But if you're in Canada, or BC, you can actually then send in a report, and it uses the GPS in your smartphone to record where you are, and then it gets sent to a provincial expert who can verify it. And so that's been really handy. I've been really promoting that to people. You probably don't have anything like that available here, but maybe that will be coming, who knows. You can always contact me for support and resources. Again, even though I'm based in Canada, we're all dealing with the same species, and I'm totally happy to help you with whatever you need, whether it's information on a species or a connection with an agency, in Washington State. You can check out our website. If you do social media, we're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So now the things that I brought with me. So this is our regional brochure, and it was really designed for the gardening and public audience. So there's a bit of background information, and then also photos of some of the common plants that I talked about today. So the photo and the bold font is of the invasive, and then the bulleted plants underneath are alternative native or non-invasive plants that would be something that you could replace the invasive with if you were trying to get rid of things. Also a resource, and again, if you want any of these websites, I'm happy to take your email down and send it to you at a later date, but one of the resources that I use on a weekly basis is called eflora.bc.ca, and it's an electronic database of all the plants in BC, including info on invasives. So it's actually a database from UBC. And again, all the plants you guys have here are the same ones that would be in the database, so no worries there. The trick is that you have to know at least a part of the name of the plant. You need to know the genus or the species or even a common name of the plant. And if you can get that far, then you can find the atlas page, and then you can find out more information about the plant, where it's found, all sorts of characteristics. There's tons of photos on there, and you can also find out whether it's invasive or not. And I often use it as a resource when I'm trying to discover whether a plant somebody's asked me about is invasive if I'm not already familiar with it. The Invasive Species Council of BC also has a number of great resources. The Not on My Property brochure was designed specifically for homeowners and for real estate professionals who have questions about knotweed. So it was a program we developed a couple years ago, and there's also a number of videos that go along with this brochure. There's like a few sort of caricatures, like, oh, the guy's discovered knotweed, and just sort of what to do. Generally, if knotweed is found on public property, we recommend that they hire a professional to deal with it. Again, because it's one of our most challenging species, and it generally is going to require the use of herbicides, which is probably something that you want an expert to catch for you. I don't know if you guys would have like sort of an expert horticulture company or gardener here that you'd be able to consult that might be able to offer that service, but I could suggest some folks in Canada that would be able to do it, and hopefully they'd be able to come down. Do you have a question?
Yeah, there's been some knotweed tree, Fort Langley.
Okay, yep.
Treated right by the railroad tracks, right where I walk, and everybody walks all day.
Yeah.
But it's back now, a year and a half. Do you tell somebody, or do they come back and look at it again?
Yes, part of my job is to try and follow up on those sorts of things. Is it really close to the railway track?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it probably is railway jurisdiction then, so if you give me some more information,
It's coming through the pavement of the sidewalk.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges of invasive plants is that there's sort of a lot of finger pointing. Like, people know that this work is expensive, and they're like, well, that's not my property, that's her property, or, governments are always pointing fingers, and it's difficult in cases like this, where it's probably shared jurisdiction, it's probably partially railroad, it's probably partially municipal, who knows if it's private, and so it gets really complicated. It's like, who's responsible, who's going to authorize,
I
who's
just
going to
thought
pay.
if they had treated it, they would check it again.
Yes, ideally that's what you would do. Anytime a herbicide treatment is done, and herbicide treatment should usually be done 2 or 3 times throughout the year if you started early in the season, and absolutely monitoring is a key piece. You always have to come back. There are sites that we're still monitoring like 3, 4, 5 years later after treatment, because especially with knotweed, you just never know. So absolutely, if it was treated, it should have been monitored and then on the list for retreatment the following year, and then, yeah, absolutely. There is another app that I'll mention called PlantNet, which is available to download now, but there's only a European version and maybe a South American version, but I've heard that the North American version is coming soon. And the really cool thing about this app is that you can actually take a picture with your phone, and then it uses the characteristics from the photo, like the color and the shape of the leaves or whatever you took the photo of, and it'll actually cross-reference millions of photos within its database, and it'll spit out a list for you of plants that it thinks it is, so it sort of identifies plants for you. And I've got the European version because that's the closest to what we have here in North America. It's sort of accurate. It's gotten some of the plants right. Some of the plants that I didn't know, like horticulture varieties, I took a photo and plugged it in, and it came back as, none of the above. And so it's sort of hit or miss, but hopefully when the North American version comes out, it will be a really useful tool for people like us. So I think that's everything for me. I brought copies of all of these resources on the back table. I also brought just a little wallet card of some of the aquatic species. Some of them I covered, some of them I didn't. And I also brought business cards if people want my email information or phone number if you want to follow up with me about anything that I've talked about.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You didn't mention my favorite horsetail.
Oh, horsetails. I thought of another one that I didn't mention either, but I saw it, and it's actually flowering. Morning glory too. It was,
Bindweed.
Bindweed, yeah.
Don't call it morning glory.
Field bindweed, yeah. Morning glory. It's got a couple common names. So.
Some people buy it as moonflower.
Moonflower. I haven't heard that before. Okay.
It's horrible.
Yeah, it is horrible. And it is invasive.
Yes.
Horsetail is not invasive. It is technically a native plant, but it is definitely something I consider a weed, because most people don't want it. And it's a challenge. I think the best advice that I have is that you have to change the pH of your soil to make it less desirable for the horsetail. And I can send you some more information if you like, but it's a challenge. I have horsetail in my yard as well. It's coming right up in my veggie garden, and it doesn't matter whether I pull it or not, because it's just right back.
I believe it's not a plant. I believe it's an organism.
It's an organism.
It's a very, very ancient kind of plant, yeah.
Pretty simple.
Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
much.